Um, while stages around the world are dark, here at Chicago Shakespeare, we've been turning unprecedented challenges to opportunities to support our community. And in true Chicago Shakespeare style, we're hard at work across our departments to create meaningful and innovative new ways to connect with our audiences, our teachers and students, artists and community through a digital platform, a new one that we are calling Shakes at Home. We're continuing to support teachers and educate our students in their virtual new classrooms everywhere with our new Romeo and Juliet stream and study program. And we're developing new ways to offer online training for actors and lifelong learning opportunities to our audience through podcasts, book discussions, and talks like this one. And it is in that spirit that it is my pleasure now to introduce you to today's speaker, Regina Buccola. You all are probably, many of you are already familiar with Gina. If you've been in her classes like this before, you'll know her. But in case there are some people who don't know Gina yet, she is professor of English at Roosevelt University and the chair of humanities there, where she specializes in Shakespeare, early modern drama, and women and gender studies. But here at Chicago Shakespeare, for over 20 years of her illustrious career with us, she is our own scholar-in-residence and an esteemed member of the Preamble Scholar Cadre, and in those capacities, I think already a familiar face to so many of you. So we are thrilled to have her here with us today. Gina, hello, and welcome from the theater.
Thanks, Marilyn. Hi, everybody. Happy Shakespeare's birthday. If I had had the supporting crew to bring this vision to reality today, I would have started this afternoon with video of me washing my hands, singing happy birthday to Shakespeare twice, as we're all supposed to do in COVID times to disinfect ourselves. So if you have to venture forth to the grocery store today or to, well, I guess to the grocery, it's one of the only places we can go, or maybe Walgreens, I invite you to disinfect when you get home by singing happy birthday 2 times, remember, to William Shakespeare. So we're going to do a little time travel today back to the 16th and 17th centuries to talk about the ways in which times like the ones that we are living through impacted Shakespeare's life from the very beginning and affected many of his plays. And then we're also going to visit via the wonders of PowerPoint, some ephemera that are preserved at the British Library, at the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford, the Folger Shakespeare Library, and also a couple of amusing treats from the gift shop at the Reconstructed Globe Theater. In a few minutes, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you this PowerPoint presentation, but I'll pop back in person at the end, and you'll also have the option of seeing a tiny me on the side of your screen during the PowerPoint also. So I have a stark line of demarcation in my grade book from this semester, marking the time right before our spring break at Roosevelt, which coincided with the immediate lead up to the stay home orders that we are all under to this day, and what has come after that. Stay home, social distancing for everyone, washing the groceries. And what it says in my grade book is hic incipit pestis, which means here begins the plague. As Ben Cohen noted in an article for Slate that some of you might have seen in March online, that was adapted from his recent book, which is called The Hot Hand, The Mystery and Science of Streaks, that phrase has a direct connection to Shakespeare, whose entire life, it turns out, was shadowed by fear of the plague. Hic incipit pestis appears in the records for Stratford-upon-Avon, where Shakespeare was born in the summer of 1564, next to the name of a deceased weaver's apprentice. The plague was particularly lethal for young children in the 16th century, which is different than what we're seeing, of course, with COVID-19. And the Shakespeares knew all too well how it could affect you because they had lost 2 of their children to previous bouts of the plague. So, having had that experience, they were likely very protective of their 3-month-old child, William, in 1564, when the plague descended on Stratford again. Had they not been vigilant, or perhaps he a particularly hardy little lad, we may not be having a birthday party for Shakespeare today or have the works of his that we have to celebrate today. So now I'm going to share my screen with you and show you some PowerPoint slides. So here's the title for my talk. Cheery, isn't it? It's quite possible that that plague outbreak that happened in Stratford in 1564 started in London in the preceding summer. We have John Stowe, an antiquarian, to thank for this grim record of weekly deaths that we see here on my screen. It might remind you of the record of deaths that we get on the nightly news, or perhaps like me when your clock radio wakes you up in the morning and we listen to WBEZ from down on Navy Pier. So as you'll see, I have this red box here because there's a similar spike. You see a curve that rises in these numbers of plague deaths. And again, this is just for London in the summer of 1563. So you see the numbers go up dramatically in the late summer and early fall. And then they go down again. There's a definite curve there. And as we'll see over the course of this afternoon, they used many similar kinds of measures to the ones that we use today to try to flatten these curves. Carried primarily by fleas, which were transported in the fur of livestock and in domestic animals like dogs and cats, and those ubiquitous urban pests, rats, the plague swept through London repeatedly after 1563, when it then seems subsequently to have gone to Stratford, returning at regular intervals during Shakespeare's lifetime, 1578 to 1579, 1582, 1592 to 1593, 1603, and 1606. The outbreaks in the 1590s and the one in 1606 were so severe that the theaters were closed. While early modern understanding of how disease was transmitted was certainly not to our standards, they did realize that packing 2,000 to 3,000 people into a theater, many of whom would be standing shoulder to shoulder as groundlings or crammed into the gallery seating, was not a good idea. So aware of the legacy of the plague's influence on the Globe Theater, you can, to this day, if you wish, purchase a plague rat hand puppet from the gift shop at the Globe Theater. When I first saw this item, I suggested that it should maybe come with detachable Velcro fleas. Thomas Dekker was a playwright and chronicler of London life in a variety of prose pamphlets over the course of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. And he documented the outbreak of the 1603 plague in a pamphlet called The Wonderful Year. So this is going to stay on the screen for a moment. I'm not going to read all of this to you. I want to just note the way in which this passage is bracketed with shout outs not to Shakespeare, but to his theater rival, Christopher Marlowe, and his play, Tamburlaine. Marlowe's play is derived from an account of a 14th century Central Asian emperor named Timur. And what he writes is, imagine that all this while death, like a Spanish leaguer, or rather like a stalking Tamburlaine, hath pitched his tents in the sinfully polluted suburbs. The plague is muster master and marshal of the field. Fear and trembling, the 2 catchpoles of death, arrest everyone. No parley will be granted, no composition stood upon, but the alarm is struck up. The tocsin rings out for life, and no voice heard but 2, 2, kill, kill. Dekker's account is framed by references to the tyrant Tamburlaine, ending with a reference to the play that his readers would likely have recognized given its popularity. 2, 2, French for kill, kill, is Tamburlaine's battle cry. It's ironic to see Dekker castigating the sinfully polluted suburbs here. Southwark, where the Globe Theater was situated, along with several other theaters and bear-baiting arenas, was considered the suburbs in this era. So the plays by which Dekker also earned a living were considered by many to be one form of the pollution that infected the area. The Reverend White, addressing Londoners at Paul's Cross during the 1577 onset of the plague, reasoned that the cause of plagues is sin, and the cause of sin are plays. Thus, he concluded it must be that the cause of plagues are plays. In a turn of events of which Fabian in Twelfth Night might likely say, if this were played upon a stage now, I could condemn it as improbable fiction, I was sent the book Theatres of Contagion to review for Theatre Journal in the end of February, so just a few months before all hell broke loose for all of us. I cheekily read it, in fact, on the last flight that I'm likely to take for quite some time, in the last weekend in early March when you could actually still take non-essential trips. Editor Fintan Walsh in this collection takes as his epigraph a quote from Michael Hart and Antonio Negri's book Empire. The age of globalization is the age of universal contagion. How well we know the truth of this statement right now. However, Theatres of Contagion was written a while ago, so it's not about our current circumstances. It's not about how legitimate fears of contagion have darkened theaters worldwide and driven us online. Numerous essays in the collection, in fact, cite the Latin origins of the term contagion. These roots are con, together with, of course, and tangere, to touch. Walsh also describes the three main ways in which we can understand this term. So first, it can be a mode of transmission, literally or metaphorically, and I want to talk about both of those possibilities. It can, of course, be a concern that's grounded in a genuine health risk that we might have. And it can also be an influence, see what I did there? Hence, viral Shakespeare. So Shakespeare has gone viral, in fact, in all of these ways over the centuries. His theater, as we've talked about already, was shut down at various junctures over the course of his career because it was perceived literally as a site of contagion, a place where even so quickly one may catch the plague. However, the theater was also perceived in Shakespeare's time as a place where one's mind could be infected, where one might get ideas about usurping a tyrannical ruler, for example, that were considered dangerous to the social order or to the health of the kingdom. His works infected the populace in both senses, the ideas in his plays and poems passing from person to person via word of mouth. So just imagine the buzz. Have you seen what's on at the Globe? Have you seen what the Lord's Chamberlain's men have put on? But also the works in their entirety passed from hand to hand in the early modern period, and then of course subsequently from generation to generation via print culture. Robert Greene, in his Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, which you may visit on the British Library website where this image comes from, complained of being upstaged by Shakespeare in 1592. The highlighted passage inside the red box identifies Shakespeare as an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you, and being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. Reversing the circumstances of his birth, in which Shakespeare seems to have escaped the ravages of a London plague when it meandered its way out to the country in Stratford, Greene here has this idea of Shakespeare as this upstart crow who's come from the country to infect the city with the products of his quill pen. Indeed, Shakespeare's writing here even infects Greene's. That tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide line parodies one from Shakespeare's own Henry VI, Part 3. In the original line, the Duke of York accuses the vengeful Margaret of Anjou, who has captured him in battle and is about to kill him, in fact, of having a tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide. One of my favorite essays in Theatres of Contagion concerns a play that Shakespeare possibly wrote during the theater closure for plague in 1592 to 1593, and that is Romeo and Juliet, which likely dates from around 1594. In an essay that is titled A Plague of Both Your Houses, Marcus Chengchai Tan chronicles the somatic effects of theater, particularly its sonic impact. So blank verse drama has aural force, both within the world of the play and on the viewing audience themselves. Romeo and Juliet is a play that is particularly rich with embedded poems, such as the sonnet that the young lovers exchange when they first meet one another. While you may not be consciously aware of these eruptions of structured verse in the midst of the blank verse and prose interludes by characters like the nurse, the rhyme and the other rhetorical devices like extended metaphors in the play set those passages apart from the surrounding language. Tan traces this aural effect in the play itself forward in time to adaptations of it, like Stephen Sondheim and Leonard Bernstein's Broadway musical adaptation of the play, West Side Story, and the finger snapping that accompanies Leonard Bernstein's complex instrumental work in the prologue conflict between the Sharks and the Jets, and in the dance number Cool. Tan argues that the sharp snapping sound heightens the viewing audience's sense of anxiety in a sort of sympathy with the tension that the Sharks and the Jets have as they encounter each other on the street, that is the stage, in that opening moment of the musical. We in the audience catch their fear and anger just as surely as the original audiences caught it from the verbal battle between the Capulets and Montagues that begins the play. I will bite my thumb at them. Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? No, sir, I do not bite my thumb at you, sir, but I do bite my thumb, sir, which then gives repetition to the word quarrel. And we sort of start to have that word repeated over and over again. And rhetorical infection is caught and a literal fight ensues between the two households. As some of you may have heard me or another of the preamble scholars discuss, just before the production of this play recently at Chicago Shakespeare Theater that was directed by Barbara Gaines, despite this Act 1 dust-up between the Capulets and the Montagues, the play is essentially a comedy until Mercutio's death in Act 3. A young couple meet and fall in love. Their furtive union is a potential way of ending the age-old conflict between their feuding families. Until, that is, the good times go bad when Romeo is confronted by Juliet's cousin Tybalt and refuses to fight him because he has already been wounded by love at first sight. The poetic trope of love at first sight relates to early modern beliefs regarding disease. Infection was thought to be airborne, potentially entering the body through the eyes, the ears, or even wafted in on aromas through the nose. Mercutio knows how unfit Romeo is to encounter an opponent like Tybalt. As soon as he hears of the challenge that Tybalt has sent to the Montague household, Mercutio runs through the points of sensorial contact through which love has infected Romeo. Alas, poor Romeo, he is already dead, stabbed with a white wench's black eye, run through the ear with a love song, and is he a man to encounter Tybalt? In the event, Romeo initially deflects the encounter with Tybalt, whom he knows, though no one else does, to actually be his cousin-in-law at this point. Mercutio takes up the challenge from Tybalt on Romeo's behalf and is disastrously killed. His dying speech contains the fatal phrase, "A plague of both your houses," a mystical 3 times. The repetition heightens the force of this dying wish that both houses, the Capulets and the Montagues, be plagued for having made worm's meat of Mercutio. We might hear this line differently now than we did when we saw this production back in December, when COVID-19 was just a mysterious ailment we had started to hear reports of, isolated to one province in China, or so we thought. Mercutio's invocation of the plague comes back to haunt both Romeo and Juliet and the dramatic plot in which they are enmeshed. It is due to the plague that Friar John cannot deliver Friar Lawrence's all-important letter to Romeo, explaining that Juliet is not really dead, but has only pretended to be dead in order to avoid a bigamous marriage to her father's choice, Paris. As Friar John explains, just at this crucial hour when Juliet will awaken is drawing on, he could not deliver the letter explaining all of this to Romeo because he was quarantined. The searchers of the town, suspecting that we both were in a house where the infectious pestilence did reign, sealed up the doors and would not let us forth. Quarantining the houses of the sick and those who had been in contact with residents in the homes of the ill were indeed strategies that were used throughout the early modern period to flatten the curve of infection, just as we see them to be used in that way today. Such homes back then were marked with a cross. Those fortunate enough to survive the plague were made to carry a white rod with them for 40 days thereafter when they went out in public, so that people would know to avoid them for continued potential infection. The infected and recently recovered were also excused from mandatory services at church on Sundays. There was state-mandated religion. So all of these things might sound familiar to us, as are restrictions such as when the plague became hot, when the number of deaths rose, Parliament and the law courts would be sent into recess, and all who could leave the city, for the countryside would do so. So you might remember, for example, the scenes on the news of the borders temporarily closed in Florida with all of the urban snowbirders like trying to flee down there and the governor trying to stop them. Barbara Gaines talked with Justin Kaufman on WBEZ this past weekend about one of the most recent aspects of Shakespeare's legacy to go viral. And this is the claim that he wrote King Lear while he was in quarantine for the plague in 1606. As Barbara pointed out, a brilliant analysis of that momentous year in Shakespeare's life and the many aspects of Lear that connect to the context in which it was indeed probably written, appears in James Shapiro's book, 1606, Shakespeare and the Year of Lear. Shapiro is one of the scholars who have recently adjusted our understanding of Shakespeare's likely writing practice. For many years, scholars took the 37 plays that Shakespeare is known to have written and divided them by the years he was known to have been active in the London theater scene, coming up with an average of 2 plays a year. However, we now understand that the much more likely scenario is that Shakespeare, a busy shareholder in a prosperous theater company and a landowner back in Stratford, worked in creative bursts. It seems likely that theater closures for the plague would have provided him with regular intervals in which to work in relative freedom from many of his usual responsibilities. The final chapter in Shapiro's book is entitled Plague. In it, Shapiro notes that there has long been a tendency to try to connect what little we know about Shakespeare's life, his biography, the death of his son, his bequest of the second best bed to his wife and his will, to his writing, and make connections between the two. However, we don't really know with certainty anything about those things or the details of Shakespeare's life. We don't have his diary, for example, or letters back home. We do know, however, as Shapiro writes, a great deal more about how a rodent-born visitation in 1606 altered the contours of Shakespeare's professional life, transformed and reinvigorated his playing company, hurt the competition, changed the composition of the audiences for whom he would write, and in turn, the kinds of plays that he could write, and enabled him to collaborate with talented musicians and playwrights. And that was an outbreak of plague in 1606. So Shapiro charts what these changes are. He essentially traces a chain reaction in the London theater world that was catalyzed by the plague. So the first aspect of this is its unique impact on the young, which effectively took 2 theater companies that had previously been sources of competition for the King's Men out of commission. And these were Paul's Boys and the Children of the Queen's Revels. So there were 2 ways in which they were affected in 1606. The first is the fact that, as I've mentioned, the plague targeted young victims. So a number of the members of these theater companies died. The second way, though, was that the children's companies were known for their satirical plays. This was partially a function of the playwrights who wrote for them, and it also seems to have been the case that they got away with more, seemingly just because the boy actors were less liable to punishment than the adult players were. However, the satirical plays had begun to grate on the nerves of their royal patrons, particularly Queen Anne by 1606, when she withdrew her patronage of the Children of the Revels. So the undermining of the Children of the Queen's Revels specifically freed up the Blackfriars Theatre for the King's Men to begin using in the winter months. That indoor space served a wealthier, better educated audience than the Globe did, and it also offered a variety of features, such as suffused candlelight rather than broad daylight, for example, that enabled better stage illusion that we see Shakespeare begin to play with in later plays like The Tempest. Finally, the body blows suffered by the boys' companies also freed up playwrights like John Fletcher and Thomas Middleton, who had previously written for the boy companies, and also the musicians who had frequently played for them. Moving forward, Shakespeare had a larger stable of writers to rely upon as a shareholder in the King's Men as a company and to collaborate with as a playwright. Working from historical documents, Shapiro provides a sobering description of the play's symptoms and some of the quack treatments that were recommended for treating it. The astrologer Simon Forman claimed to have treated himself and survived an earlier outbreak of the plague. And on that basis, he considered himself immune and therefore ministered to people during the outbreak in 1606. So you're looking right now at his signature, which is preserved in a manuscript that's held by the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. And then also down on the right, the charts that he would work up for his patients from a volume that's in the same collection at the Bodleian. The initial symptoms that Forman and others recorded in their casebooks will sound familiar to us from COVID-19 alerts. Fever, a racing pulse, and breathlessness, followed by pain in the back and legs, thirstiness, and stumbling. Forman's first son, Clement, was born at home during the 1606 plague outbreak. On the same day that his son was born, one of Forman's servants fell ill outside of his home and was brought back by a neighbor. There is no evidence that Forman realized she was becoming ill or that he had sent her out of the house for that reason. But the coincidence of a baby having just been born in the Forman household and a sick servant being sent outside of it was all the evidence that the neighbors needed. Taking quarantine measures into their own hands, they moved swiftly to barricade the entire Forman family in the house. Forman wrote that they told him, "It was better that I and my household should starve and die than any of them should be put in danger." Fortunately, his servant did not prove to be ill with the plague, and the household apparently had sufficient supplies on hand to last out the quarantine. Others who were so barricaded in by terrified neighbors practicing vigilante healthcare were not so lucky. Forman was not the only one who trafficked in remedies for the plague. Here we have an advertisement that is held by the British Library promising just such a cure. What I love about this is at the very top, it begins with testimonials, the names of those as have been cured. If this were an advertisement today, we might see a small disclaimer in the bottom of the screen assuring us that these are actual plague survivors and not professional actors. Much like a modern day ad, the proper administration of the powder being sold to cure the plague is described along with the side effects that one might expect to experience if you take it. It says in part, if anyone is infected and finds themselves ill, then presently let them without delay take this powder and then to bed and sweat carefully for 3 hours. And if they are dry, make a posset with sage or sorrel or dandelion, and so drink freely in their sweat or afterwards. And be sure after your sweat you keep yourself warm. And if any swelling appear, beware of drinking any beer or ale, hot or cold, but keep yourselves to the above said posset drink, or beer or ale boiled with a crust of brown bread. Put the powder in a spoon with a little beer or posset drink, and so take it. So in short, don't drink beer or ale unless you need to drink beer or ale. So you may have also seen, to wrap things up a bit here, some of the furor that was ignited on the web in one of the latest ways that Shakespeare has gone viral. And this is the internet memes surrounding the probably completely innocent tweet that Roseanne Cash sent. I think it was just meant to be inspirational on March 14th of 2020. Indeed, as she says here, it does seem possible that King Lear first performed at court on St. Stephen's Day, which is December 26th of 1606, was written during the closure of the theaters in 1606 for plague. Instead, Cash's tweet rapidly went viral, becoming a nexus for expressing the many ways in which Shakespeare, mostly for good, sometimes for ill, continues to operate like a contagion in our world. So, for example, it didn't take long for the authorship controversy to rear its head. Luckily, Shakespeare was available to weigh in. Speculation about Shakespeare's personal life also came into the fray. So there were two daughters, not three, like King Lear, but you know, hey, we take their point. And then there's this delightful passage from King Lear where indeed he does talk about a plague sore. I didn't get into that symptom. It comes after the others. And then some personal thoughts on that. And then finally, of course, parodic revisiting of some of Shakespeare's most iconic lines. So I have remarked many times over the years at these luncheons how extremely lucky Chicago Shakespeare Theater is to have supporters as smart, loyal, and dedicated to Shakespeare and his works as they are performed at our theater, as all of you are. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Shakespeare and his fellow shareholders in first the Lord Chamberlain's Men and subsequently the King's Men counted on their patrons when the theaters were closed during times of plague, just like the theater is counting on all of us right now. So it's now my pleasure to open up the floor for Q&A and ask Dottie to join me for that.
Hi, Gina.
Hey, Dottie.
As always, thank you for such an educational and entertaining presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list, and we've started to get some Q&As here as well too. I just want to remind everyone that you can use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions, and we'll also be watching the chat if you put any in there as well. But our first question comes from Erin, and she asks, did Shakespeare or his contemporaries write about their views on what should have been done after the plague ran its course? Some sort of ex post review.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in Shapiro's really fantastic book, one of the things that he talks about is that except for things like that reference to goneril being a plague sore, you know, a sort of metaphorical use, the writers of this period did not, in fact, really write a lot about the plague. So one of the writers who does is Ben Jonson, but he does it always in a sort of satirical way. So for example, he talks about a woman character in one of his plays being as noisy as the plague bell and as an incessant. So they would ring a bell for plague deaths. And as you can imagine, when you see some of those numbers from John Stowe of, you know, like almost 2,000 people that die, you know, in a single week, that would be kind of constant tolling of a bell. So except for references like that, the playwrights really didn't write about it. And it kind of seems like it might have been they were treating the theater as a way to escape from the realities of dealing with plague. And so it wasn't really something that they wrote directly about. And they seemed to understand why the theaters needed to be closed. So unlike some of the protests that I think we're seeing today of people who are objecting to the stay-home orders now, I think that the theaters were mostly compliant with the fact that they needed to shut down when the plague was running amok.
Great, thanks, Gina. Our next question is from Bill, and he asks, did life during the plague return to normal quickly as the sickness slacked?
Also a great question. And it does kind of seem from the descriptions that Foreman and others who document these experiences provide that it was sort of similar to the analogy that I heard on the news this morning about the governor of Vermont saying that you're going to have to slowly turn the spigot back on, you know, like a quarter turn at a time. So as I was mentioning, they would mark the homes of people who had suffered plague. And then also when someone had recovered from the plague, because there were people who recovered, you know, even given the staggering rates of death, there were people who made successful recoveries. They would then have to carry that wand so that they would be visible publicly and people could sort of avoid them if they needed to. And they were also asked to stay away from church for the same 40-day period if they had been ill. So they seem to have had a similar kind of mentality about sort of slowly restoring things to normal. What we know is that the theaters would be closed once the deaths topped 30 in a day, which is really not that many, in the grand scheme of things. And particularly if you think about a scenario where, unlike today, we don't have the sort of epidemiology to be able to track things like that. So at a relatively low number of daily deaths, they would close down public gathering spaces, and they could not reopen until the deaths had gone below that number again. So there are a lot of similarities to the experience that we are now having.
Great, thank you. The next question is about Shakespeare's collaborators. And since we know that he collaborated at times with a team of writers, this person would like to know how much, if any, credit was given to additional contributors in his published works.
Well, this is a great question. Some of you might have seen the article in the TLS by Brian Vickers, sort of this new war that's being waged over some of the recent writing that's come out by editors of the Oxford Shakespeare and also the forthcoming Oxford Marlowe collected works, excuse me, not Middleton, Marlowe. So there have been these efforts, which those of you who have heard me speak about these plays over the years probably know this is not the kind of research that I do. And in fact, I think it's in part because I am so interested by theater from all eras. And I consider theater to be a very collaborative enterprise. And I think that it was in Shakespeare's era too. So I think that there's a sort of strange way in which the fixation on Shakespeare as a figure from this era means that we alternately either dismiss the ideas of collaboration that probably fully went on, or alternately are kind of weirded out by that. And I'm not suggesting that the person who asked the question is. I just think that this is part of why this becomes such a fraught issue in things like the Times Literary Supplement, for example. But so there have been lots of attempts to try to figure out who wrote which parts of collaborative plays. And I should say that this is not only confined to the work of Shakespeare. So for example, John Fletcher collaborated quite a bit with another writer named Francis Beaumont. And I have a colleague at Northwestern, Jeffrey Maston, who has done some work on those two writers. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, almost any method that we have now of trying to figure out after the fact who wrote which parts of which plays is subject to flaws. So the method that's being used currently, that's described in the Times Literary Supplement, is a sort of like computer-based analysis of sort of like Venn diagrams of commonly used terms and common sort of like truncations of words. So like a plague, a both, your houses, that kind of thing, because not all writers do those kinds of contractions in the same way. And so, but this is of course open to all kinds of potential flaw, because we know that the playwrights themselves didn't set the type in the printing house for the published versions of their plays. So there's all kinds of points in time at which those sorts of variants could have been introduced into the text that don't necessarily correlate to the person who wrote it. So I just usually kind of satisfy myself with knowing that probably more than one person was involved in a number of these plays. And that to me, again, just rings like truth. That's the way you work in the theater. And so bearing in mind too, that the published versions of the plays were almost never done until the play had been sort of exhausted of its use in the playhouse. In fact, I didn't talk about this today, but that's one of the ways that we know that the children of the Queen's rebels were in trouble in 1606. They were selling off their plays. And you didn't really do that at that period of time if you could still count on bringing an audience into the theater to pay, by the person to see them. The analogy that I draw now is that it's kind of like, Mulan got released directly to streaming, right? Because they couldn't bring us into movie theaters to see it in these times that we are living in of stay home. But if they had been able to get us in the theater, you better believe they would have charged, $15 a head or whatever it is now to go see a movie in the theater, so that families would come there and bring all their kids and pay $20 for a bucket of popcorn, as opposed to, having everyone in your house watch it for the same fee to stream it. It was a similar logic about publishing the plays. And so there had probably been a fair bit of tinkering with the texts on the basis of the experience of performing them in the theaters by the time we get to the point of a published text. So I think that we actually see, beyond just the playwrights whose names might appear on the title pages of plays, or who we might have figured out were involved in these plays, there were probably a number of other people who were involved along the way in shaping them into what they ultimately became.
Great, thanks, Gina. Our next question comes from Ginger, and she wants to know if there was, what the views were from state authorities during the time of Contagion, and really the role that they played, and the trust that people who were sick had with those officials.
Well, this is a really interesting question. So as I was saying to some of the people at the theater just before we joined all of you today, I was teaching Macbeth right before I came into this webinar, and we were at the end of the play today, and we were talking about the issue of tyranny in the play and some of the contrasts that are drawn between different types of rulers that we see described and hear about in the world of the play. And so one of those types of rulers is the King of England at the time, who of course provides the troops that Malcolm, the heir to the throne after Duncan is murdered, brings with him from England to help be successful in the fight against Macbeth. Once he's become a tyrant and it's clear he needs to be removed from office. And so one of the points of contrast there is that King Edward at the time in England is known for healing people with his touch. So there's this whole description in Act 4 of that play about how he would touch people and heal them of scrofula, or the king's evil, as it was called. And that is very different from King James. This might, in fact, maybe be a little implicit criticism of James that is in that play. Because when the plague raged in London in the 17th century, James left for the countryside and went hunting. So he would go on extended hunting jags out in the countryside and was not there to show leadership to the people. And so that's very different from what we're seeing, I think, right now from our leaders. We are having daily check-ins from the president, our governor, our mayor, et cetera, et cetera. And they are here. They're coming to us remotely to preserve the safe distance, social distancing rules, and so forth. But they're here. They're present for us and with us, and they're leading us through this. And that's very different than what people would have experienced with King James.
Thanks, Gina. There's two questions that I'm going to combine a little bit about this period. One question is, did the size of a typical cast change during this period? So was the number reduced to give actors more space between each other? And then also, what were the sets like during this period? So there's curiosity around if theaters closed from one day to the next, if there were more minimal set pieces put into place.
Great questions. So in this period of time, we know that the theaters themselves use very limited things in terms of props and sets. And there were a few reasons for that. So one is the expense of it, right? Another is the fact that they were not performing plays in the way that we do now. So I mentioned, back in December, all those lovely spaces at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, there were, 2 or 3 plays, depending on the week you're talking about, that you could see at any given time. So the Q brothers were up with The Christmas Carol in the yard, and we had Romeo and Juliet on stage in the Courtyard Theater that you're seeing behind me now. And then I think there was something that came and toured for part of December as well that was in the studio space. But that was just what you could see, right? That's not the way that the theater companies at this period operated. They wanted to maximize as many people in their theaters as they could. So they performed in a repertory system where they did different plays every day. The idea being that they wanted to pull in as many audience members as possible. And if you were up, say, visiting from the country to sell some of your goods in London, you might potentially go to the theater more than one time while you were there for, say, a 2 or 3 day stay. So that was the mode in which they operated. And so obviously having limited or minimal set, or props going on facilitated that, because you didn't have to make changes to the stage space. You just walked out there with whatever props you carried and the costumes that you were wearing, and let the language convey the surroundings. And that was true in the indoor theater space, the Blackfriars Theater too. That was not a space where they used a great deal of props. Now, the big exception to this is when court masks would be performed. So at court, when you would go to see a mask, M-A-S-Q-U-E, those were ironically really expensive and very set and costume heavy, but performed only one time. So during James's reign, these became something of a political scandal because they were so cost intensive and labor intensive to produce, but they were only done one time. And it was considered a sort of exorbitant waste of money. Because they were far more expensive to perform than the plays of this era in the public theaters would be. And we don't know that Shakespeare wrote court masks. He has some plays where they appear as a feature. So in All Is True or Henry VIII, there's a dance, a formal dance that is performed with the king sort of crashes at a party. And The Tempest, of course, has a mask in it that's interrupted when Prospero realizes that a conspiracy against his life is underway. But other than that, we don't know Shakespeare to have written these. In terms of cast sizes, bear in mind that actors of this era were really put to it. So not only were they holding numerous parts in their heads all at one time because they might have to do, you know, Hamlet one day and Macbeth the next, they also, other than the principal parts, were frequently doubling or tripling even the roles that they were playing in any given play. So you could kind of maximize the number of parts you could get out of a pretty limited number of people. So if you're interested by this, Tiffany Stern, spelled just like, you know, the adjective, S-T-E-R-N, she has written a really great book called Shakespeare in Parts, where she sort of goes through the major plays and talks about the ways in which you can sort of figure out how many actors would have been needed to pull this off by sort of seeing who cannot be on stage at the same time. You know, like are there two characters that this person can't possibly play because they're on the stage simultaneously? So it's a really fascinating look at what potential cast sizes were. Even in some cases with plays where the list of characters looks pretty huge, you actually can pull it off with a smaller number of actors than you might think. And then when they would tour in the provinces, the theater companies, which they did for a variety of reasons, they would usually take a sort of truncated, perhaps, version of the play and certainly a smaller group of cast. Because again, cost. It cost less to move a smaller group of people, to feed them on the road, etc. So we do know that they had smaller cast plays that would be sent out to tour the provinces. And that also comes up with respect to the plague, because once the plague was hot, as I described, and they closed the theaters, they did also secure the borders. So at one point during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, there was actually an order while she was at Windsor that if anyone came to Windsor from London, they were to be hanged on sight because the plague was known to be raging in London, and they did not want to risk any infection of the monarch or her surrounding courtiers. That's extreme, obviously, and that was not common. But so one of the things that we also know is that if the players sensed that the plague was coming on, like, you know, if they had seen some bills of death start to be posted, they did sometimes get their touring players out of town before stop orders happened. And you can sort of see records of this from time to time, particularly in the 1590s. So the plague could actually prompt touring in the provinces, which I'm not sure the people in the provinces really appreciated, you know, when they bring all their flea-infested costumes that might have the plague in them, you know, with them on the road. That might be how the plague came from London to Stratford when Shakespeare was born in 1564.
Great, Gina. We wish we had more time to answer all the questions that are coming in, but sadly we just have time for one last one. And you had mentioned in your presentation that we're lucky that the Shakespeares took good care of their baby boy, or that perhaps he was a strong lad. But are there other figures from this period who either did not survive the plague or who did survive the plague that really, you know, were an addition to our history?
Absolutely. So we do know about a number of people who unfortunately died. So one of the other things that James Shapiro outlines in 1606, and that also comes up in a really fantastic book by Charles Nicholl, that the exact title is escaping me at the moment. It has Silver Street in the title because that is the street that Shakespeare lived on in London. He had a landlord in London that lived in Silver Street, and we actually know a decent bit about that period of time because he was involved in some legal matters for his landlord and his wife, about securing a marriage agreement for the daughter and all these kinds of things. So it's a cute little sort of glimpse of his life in London that you get via these documents surrounding people that he leased property from to, live in the city while he was working at the Globe. But so during one of the outbreaks of plague, Shapiro, the 1606 outbreak, he charts the way in which Shakespeare was just really lucky at that point in time too, because the neighborhood that he was living in was not one that was particularly affected by the plague. Other areas of London really, really were, and that was one area that was not. So we know that Ben Jonson lost a son to the plague when he was about 7 years old, and that is very similar to Shakespeare himself. And indeed, there have been some films and so forth that have imagined the two of them sort of commiserating about this. And indeed, that's likely. I mean, do we know that happened? No. Does it seem quite possible that it would have? Sure. I mean, we know those two knew each other very well. Jonson wrote dedicatory poetry for the First Folio when it was published in 1623. Shakespeare appears in a cast list for one of his plays. And the poem that Jonson wrote about the death of his son is just incredible. So he says, here lies Ben Jonson, his best piece of poetry, which just kills me every time I see it. And this is talking about his child who died of illness. And then we also know that there are playwrights and so forth of this era who ran afoul of the law, who died subsequently, either because of the effects of the way that they were tortured when they were taken in for questioning, or perhaps because they were made ill, because they had been compromised by being in prison, which unfortunately we're seeing happening again now too during the time of COVID. And one of those writers was Thomas Kyd, who wrote The Spanish Tragedy, which is a really successful and influential play, a revenge tragedy that influenced Christopher Marlowe's writing and certainly Shakespeare's too, particularly with plays like Hamlet. Now back to
you. Thank you again, Gina, for a fantastic event. And we did have some other questions, and we've taken note of those, so we'll try to get in touch with you individually with some of the answers to those. But Gina, again, we thank you as always. It's so wonderful to see you. And to all of our attendees out there, a big thank you to you all. Your past partnership has helped us to build a home for Shakespeare in Chicago, a home which we are very much looking forward to returning to when it is safe to do so. And in the meantime, your continued commitment to our organization will carry us through and help us to launch new digital initiatives like today's program, as well as other exciting virtual content. And as today happens to be Shakespeare's 456th birthday, today's Zoom luncheon was just one of 3 celebratory events planned for today. For a true birthday extravaganza, make sure to tune in tonight at 7:30 p.m. Central Time for our Toast to Shakespeare. This 30-minute event features artistic director Barbara Gaines, along with an outstanding lineup of some of your favorite Chicago Shakespeare actors. And coming up in just an hour is our first virtual book club discussion. Join us at 2:30 today for an informal discourse about The Tempest. Links to both of these events are going to be put in the chat window, which is right to the right of your Zoom window. And to fund these programs for audiences like you, as well as new initiatives for actors, educators, first responders, and healthcare facilities, we've recently launched the Brave New World campaign. We hope that those of you who are able to continue your support of our organization will consider giving a gift of any size to this emergency relief fund. Together with friends like you, we can support artists, audiences, students, and our community. So with that, thank you again for all virtually joining us today and for your past generosity as donors. These are challenging times, but with you by our side, we can rebuild Chicago Shakespeare Theater for this brave new world and to use the arts to bring our city together. So from all of us at Chicago Shakespeare Theater, stay safe, stay healthy, stay connected. We'll see you very soon.